Hey there, I'm Chroma, and welcome to part 6 of Making an Abstract Adventure. Welcome back. This time, we've been working more on creating the abilities that our two characters will have. More specifically, working towards our cube character having this sort of throwing projectile attack, and our sphere having this sort of air lunge dash thing and being able to launch through the air. And working towards that, they're both going to be sort of working off a similar system where you aim the shot with an arrow pointer thing, and then you let go, and then you'll fly in that direction or shoot a projectile in that direction. So, better explained by showing, I guess. I'll start with both of them it's the same, but with the sphere character. Basically having this arrow UI thing pointing in a direction, and then you'd let go, and then for the sphere, get launched in that direction. For the cube, you'd throw a projectile in that direction. At the moment, button-wise, so in anticipation for a controller, what I'm hoping for is, so while the left control stick would be used for moving, and that translates to WASD, the right control stick will do that arrow thing, and it'll be kind of like a slingshot, sort of, where you pull back, and then there's the arrows, and then you let go, and it goes in that direction. So keyboard-wise, I've used I, J, K, and L to sort of represent that, but thinking of it as like a right control stick on any controller. Although I probably will, in some sort of options menu, have an option to invert it or whatever, because it seems like a good idea to do. So at the moment, though, hitting any of the 4 buttons will have this arrow sort of go in the opposite direction of it. At the moment, because it's only 4 keys, it's kind of sticking to just, like, the 4 main directions and then, like, diagonal. But with a controller, you could have anything that's, like, anything in between. At least that's the hope. And it works for both of these. And then there's also some other safety measures in place for that. When you die, the arrow disappears in a second? Yeah, and stuff like that. So now let's get into the code of how this is done, because this is also the same for both. Over on our, so player lineup is what I called it, just, I guess, yeah. Actually, first I want to show what the actual game objects look like. So they're, at the moment, hidden below the stage, but they just get disabled as soon as the level starts, so even if they were up here, you wouldn't see them. They're just kind of so that they're out of the way. So they're separate game objects that aren't even attached to our two characters here. And at the moment, they're just a bunch of shapes from our sprites here that are just manipulated to look like an arrow and rotated and all of that. So that's, and then colored to match what the characters look like. But their designs will probably change. This is kind of just placeholder for now, and some design to it so it looks decent for now, until it gets a makeup with looking a lot better. And then there's not much on the actual game objects themselves. Most of the coding is done through the actual game objects themselves. So the the script that's on our players is just called player lineup, as we just saw, and it has 2 public variables. One for the rotation smoothing of it rotating in a desired direction when you're pressing the buttons, and then a arrow game object that is getting a reference to the actual arrow. And on the 2 different characters, it's the same, just getting a reference to their respective arrows. So now over to the code to show how it's actually working. So starting off, we have the public variables we just saw, followed by 2 hidden in inspector public variables used by other scripts for whether we're in the process of aiming or whether we've released the buttons. And these aren't being used just yet, but they will be when we've made the separate scripts that will deal with launching us through the air or shooting a projectile. They'll get references to these scripts to do that. More specifically, on release, like as soon as we release the buttons, that being set to true, that'll kind of be the flag for launching a projectile or launching us through the air. Then we have private variables for the current rotation of the arrows, and then a private bool called input received that we'll get into later where that's used. So on start, we just because we already have the reference to the arrow, we're just setting it to false because we want it to be disabled. And then skipping this at the moment, going down to here, a public lineup function that's called in both the circle main and the square main scripts, which then also get references to these scripts there, and then in an update function are calling the player lineup. And the order of these doesn't matter too much, I believe, other than double jump being before jump. But even like attack and lineup, their orders are kind of interchangeable for now. We'll see if that becomes something necessary later on. But anyways, regardless, let's go into how this is all working. So starting off, input received, we're setting that to false. So basically how this variable is being used is at the beginning of this, what is the equivalent of an update frame, we're setting it to false, and then if any of these keys are pressed, we're setting it to true, and then doing stuff down here of whether any of the keys were pressed. So that, as opposed to just having like something run in each of these cases where something's pressed, basically having this all clause of if any button has been pressed this frame, that doing stuff towards whether we're aiming or the being released, that kind of stuff. So then to set the rotation, the desired rotation of the arrow, we're using this rotation variable to do that. We're starting it off equaling 360 as like a temporary number, and then depending on what button they're pressing, setting the rotation to a few fixed values here. And then when we get to, so like these first two are for down and up, either being 0 or 180, but then getting to left and right, a bit more code involved of for specific directions of getting the 45 like diagonal degrees, directions, whatever. So here we're testing, so if they've pressed J, so I'd be going to the right technically because of the slingshot backwards thing. We're then testing if rotation was set to 0 up here, and if it was, I'm just manually setting it to what that 45 in between would be. Otherwise, setting it to, so basically, depending on what these are, so if more than one button is being pressed, we're setting it to that in between, and it's a bunch of hard-coded values right now. There probably could be some mathematical calculations to deal with this, but this also helps stop overflow a bit of something rotating beyond a 360 degrees. This 360 is kind of a placeholder. This could be any number, more or less. Yeah, this is just, I don't know, I just made it that just because. So then after all this is done, a rotation value has been calculated of what way the arrow should be facing. So then first we just see if any input has been received, and if any of the buttons have been pressed, then yes, it has, because we're setting it to true in any of them. And then we're running this. Skipping down here for a second, if we haven't received any input and we were aiming, so like the arrow was on and we were in the middle of aiming, but now there's no input, that's us releasing the button, so we should then do whatever action. So for the cube, the projectile, the sphere, the launching, so then we're setting aiming to false, release to true, and then turning off the arrow. And then release being true will be used in another script somewhere else eventually to do stuff. But going back up here, if we have pressed something, if we weren't aiming before, then we're aiming now, so then we set the arrow to true. And then, and then in order to find out its position and rotation, so we're just setting the arrow's position to our position, because it should always be on the player. And then the rotation is using quaternion dot spherical interpolation, or slurp, I guess, to have it smoothly rotate towards where we want it to rotate towards. It's very exactly similar to like vector 3 dot lerp or linear interpolate. Just the S1 works better for rotations and whatnot. So yeah, so that's how that's working. And then a few changes have been made elsewhere, I believe. If I'm not mistaken, yeah. So also a few controls have been changed a bit as well, I believe. Attacking, I changed to being like U or something, because I'm going to use Q, E, U and O, as being those 4 buttons that are kind of above the directional buttons that we'll be using. Those will be the main kind of action buttons there, as well as space for jumping. Shift and control might do something as well. Actually, over here, left control is to change characters. But again, I'm kind of trying to make this work for a controller and then trying to map it to a keyboard as best as possible. So in action, showing that off, well, again, basically, yeah, so we're pressing a button, aim to set to true, and the whatever, based on the combination of buttons that we're pressing, the arrow moves in different directions. And then also, because of the way, like the order of the if statements, if you're pressing like I and K at the same time, it'll go up. And if you're hitting like J and L at the same time, it's going to go right. That's just the order of, like, that's based on the order of the if statements. I guess you could have some special case if you wanted to for that case, if they're pressing the 2 opposites. But that shouldn't also happen on a controller ever, so I don't think that's something we need to worry about. And if it is, then again, we'll deal with it if that happens. But in this case, it really shouldn't. But anyway, so, okay, I was looking around because I was pretty sure I forgot something that I wanted to talk about, and I did. So with the disable arrow function, I kind of skipped that entirely, but it kind of does what it looks like. It is a public function that can be called that'll turn off the arrow, set aiming, and release to false. But as well, where this actually gets used is from the player health script, where when the player is dying, or just when they've gotten hurt in any way, we disable the arrow just because. So down here we have when the damage script runs, depending on if it's the circle or the square, we're calling the player lineup, getting reference to the player lineup script from the circle or square main, and then running the disable arrow function, which we can do that because on the square main, for example, it's set to the hide inspector public, so it's not showing up in the inspector, but we can still access it in scripts. So that's where that's being taken care of. Yeah, that should be it for that, though. As well, one thing I kind of missed on explaining last episode with the wall jumping is that in some other scripts, like the double jumping and the jumping, the guy got a reference to the square wall jump script and then set making sure that we're not about to wall jump before double jumping in this example, and same thing with normal jumping. Basically some tests to see whether we should be wall jumping or double jumping or normal jumping. So that's where that is taking care of all of that. But it's basically just a few small additions just to fix up some bugs that were happening with having a double jump and a wall jump happen in the same frame and just things like that. But anyway, so now we have this up and running. Next, I'll be working on, I've already kind of started to, but the circle lunge slash thing, pulling back, making the arrow, and then letting go and sort of launching through the air. Useful for, like, I guess, like getting across gaps or launching up to high places, that kind of stuff. And then the cube character, because they're going to be like a samurai ninja type person, it'll be throwing like a shuriken ninja star type thing. At least that's the hope. And then eventually then having that be able to hit targets and enemies or whatever level design stuff that we come up with. But anyways, that'll do it for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I'll see you around.